One August evening, after finishing her dinner, Li Laotai picked up the small stool from the living room and, as usual, went downstairs for a walk to aid digestion. Just like always, she bumped into Zhao Laotai, who was also out for a stroll. When the two old ladies met, they greeted each other with the usual question, "Have you eaten?" After receiving confirmation, they chuckled for a moment before settling down in a small corner, sitting on their stools with crossed legs and slightly hunched backs. With narrowed eyes, they began their customary post-dinner chatter. As the two old ladies huddled together, they initially talked about the daily affairs of their households. But soon enough, their conversation shifted, their voices lowered, and they began gossiping about the shortcomings of their neighbors. Let me tell you, that old Kiao from the east side of the neighborhood is not decent at all. The other day, I saw him sneakily peeking at the granddaughter of old Chen. Oh my, really? At this age, still eyeing the young ones? Tut, shameless. Engrossed in their conversation, the two old ladies spoke fervently, spitting out words that sprayed around them. Lost in the heat of their discussion, they leaned in closer, their voices growing even quieter. Neither of them noticed the disheveled woman slowly approaching, nor did they notice the woman tightly gripping a kitchen knife. Zhao Laotai, deeply engrossed in Li Laotai's whispered tales of the neighbors, suddenly caught sight of the woman standing beside them. Just as Zhao Laotai was about to pull the woman into their conversation, she saw the woman raise her hand high, then bring it down forcefully. A streak of silver light, tinged with the hues of the setting sun, swiftly passed before Zhao Laotai's eyes, and crimson, scalding liquid splattered across her face and clothes. Wide-eyed, Zhao Laotai stood frozen in place, with Li Laotai collapsing in front of her, a long and deep gash across her neck, blood gushing out steadily. The woman with disheveled hair stood nearby, holding the knife, her head bowed. Seeing Li Laotai trembling as she reached to cover her bleeding neck, the woman suddenly lifted her hand again and struck down, viciously aiming at Li Laotai's head. Murder! Someone's been killed! Zhao Laotai's screams echoed throughout half the neighborhood. She couldn't fathom how, after just a casual chat, Li Laotai could suddenly meet with such a terrible fate. People always say, don't care about what others think, just be yourself. Xianxia has been a very obedient child since she was young, and she has always followed this principle. However, she couldn't understand why this world is always filled with lies. Xianxia was born cute and lovely. Everyone who saw her would compliment her. She was a well-known beauty in the neighborhood. From a young age, she was polite and would greet everyone she saw with a wave of her little arm. With her chubby cheeks and round eyes, she was truly adorable. The neighbors also treated Xianxia very well. Every time she went downstairs with her little school bag, the uncles, aunties, grandpas, and grandmas would smile and talk to her, praising her continuously. Such a beautiful girl. When she grows up, she'll surely become an outstanding beauty. Xianxia, when you grow up, you'll be even more beautiful than those celebrities on TV. Because of these compliments, little Xianxia had a happy childhood. As she grew up and came into contact with books and more people, she slowly realized that the praise of others couldn't always be taken at face value. For example, Mrs. Li from next door always praised her in front of her but would whisper to other neighbors, "Oh, such a pretty girl, but it's not good to attention-seeking. She'll surely get into trouble in the future. What's the use of being so good-looking? She's been vain since she was young, surely not good at studying." Xianxia used to like Mrs. Li the most, but ever since Mrs. Li's grandson, Guo, told her what Mrs. Li said about her, she no longer liked that hypocritical old lady. However, she still had to maintain her facade. Even though she didn't like Mrs. Li from across the street anymore, she still had to greet her politely whenever they met. But soon enough, Xianxia discovered that Mrs. Li's words were venomous indeed. Mrs. Li not only badmouthed Xianxia in her own home, but also repeated those words to other elderly neighbors she met during her evening walks. This was truly going too far. However, as the book said, one should ignore idle gossip and just be oneself with a clear conscience. so Xianxia stopped minding it. After all, Mrs. Li was from an older generation. She continued going to school and back home as usual, still greeting everyone she met. Xianxia and Mrs. Li's grandson, Guo, were in the same class, and they got along quite well. But boys will always be more mischievous than girls. Guo didn't like studying much, and naturally, his exam results weren't as good as Xianxia's, who always paid attention in class. Perhaps because the class teacher always praised Xianxia during parent-teacher meetings, Mrs. Li started to resent the girl who always seemed to overshadow her grandson. One time, Xianxia walked out without wearing her glasses and inadvertently passed by Mrs. Li without noticing her. This incident completely infuriated Mrs. Li. Just look at her. I was right beside her, but she didn't even glance at me, just walked past like that. Sigh, kids these days, so rude. The older she gets, the less likable she becomes. I've always said she's prone to mischief. Look at her now. Xianxia was completely unaware of these things. All she knew was that ever since that incident, the gazes of the neighbors in the vicinity seemed to have subtly changed when they looked at her. When Xianxia was 12 years old, her father passed away due to illness. In an instant, the family fell apart, and her mother aged significantly overnight. Xianxia became a child from a single-parent family. She was no longer the little princess pampered by her parents, and people's gaze towards her changed from admiration to pity. Xianxia became silent. She immersed herself in her studies, with no interest in anything else around her. Every day after school, she would come home and bury herself in her books. She understood that her mother had high expectations of her, and she knew that the only way to change her life was through diligent studying. However, whenever Xianxia passed by groups of neighbors chatting together, she would hear faint murmurs reaching her ears. Poor girl, she lost her father at such a young age. I heard she's suffering from depression. I agree. She's not as talkative as she used to be when she was younger. Depression is not easy to treat. It costs a lot of money. Oh dear, I feel sorry for her mother, having to raise a daughter with such fragile mental health. Xianxia felt angry at the behavior of these gossiping women, but she believed that she shouldn't let these things bother her. After all, those people were just idle talkers, and they couldn't really influence her life. She vowed that when she truly changed her fate, she would shut these people up with her achievements. However, little did Xianxia know that some habits, maintained for decades, could completely alter someone else's life. In high school, during the holidays, Xianxia took on a part-time job as a waitress in a restaurant. The boss required them to wear makeup and maintain a dignified appearance, which he believed was a sign of respect towards the customers. This reignited the gossip, led by Mrs. Li. Such a young girl, not focusing on her studies, but instead spending her time applying makeup. She doesn't even stay at home during the holidays. What's she up to? What else can a pretty young girl do? Look at her, she's painted her face like a fox. Growing up, she's surely gone astray. You see, it's just as I said. Xianxia realized that once someone had a negative opinion of you, they would believe everything you did was wrong. Even if what you did wasn't wrong at all, they would brainwash themselves and others into thinking you were entirely in the wrong. They're all a bunch of busybodies who like to meddle in other people's affairs. Xianxia thought angrily. As the school year approached, Xianxia quit her waitress job and focused on catching up on her studies. However, Mrs. Li continued her gossip. Look at her, such a big girl now, but during the holidays, she doesn't bother to find a part-time job to help her mother earn some money. Instead, she just lazes around at home. One day, Xianxia forgot to bring in her laundry from the balcony, and it blew down to the ground. As she hurried downstairs to retrieve it, she overheard Mrs. Li, who was sunbathing downstairs, muttering, "It's a black bra, such a young age, wearing such mature things. Shameless." Due to her college entrance exam preparation, Xianxia enrolled in a cram school. After school, she attended extra classes until late at night. Concerned for her safety, some male classmates kindly offered to walk her home. Unfortunately, Mrs. Lee, who happened to be taking out the trash, witnessed this. The next day, rumors spread throughout the neighborhood that the girl from the He family on the third floor of Building B had gotten drunk in the middle of the night and was escorted home by a group of boys. It was truly shameless. Thanks to Mrs. Lee's influence, He Sheng's anger reached its peak. She realized that slanderous gossip like this could be spread with impunity. Originally, He Sheng didn't want to pay attention to it. After all, justice will prevail. However, her mother inexplicably believed the gossip and immediately scolded He Sheng upon returning home. "What's wrong with you? The older you get, the worse you become. You've even learned how to drink now? Are you honoring your deceased father? Mom, why do you believe those rumors spread by the old ladies?" He Sheng was trembling with anger, explaining the situation, but her mother, though she listened, seemed only half convinced. "It's not that I don't believe you, but the whole neighborhood is talking about it. Mrs. Lee is slandering you. Surely, if other people are saying the same thing, it can't all be false." He Sheng was speechless. She truly realized that rumors were even more terrifying than ferocious beasts and raging floods. Maintaining an attitude of "don't provoke me, and I won't bother you," when He Sheng filled out her university application, she decisively chose a city thousands of kilometers away. With her good performance in the college entrance examination, she was naturally admitted. On the day of departure, she and her mother, carrying a large suitcase, descended the stairs together. Once again, they encountered Mrs. Lee and her persistent group of gossipers downstairs. He Sheng felt her anger rising at the sight of them, so she chose to ignore them altogether. Mrs. Lee's grandson also participated in the college entrance examination, but his performance was mediocre, barely qualifying for a vocational school. He Sheng felt triumphant this time. Seeing her mother proudly telling others about her daughter's admission to a certain university, she glanced at Mrs. Lee and indeed saw her sneer, a disdainful expression on her face. As He Sheng and her mother walked away, they overheard Mrs. Lee's sour complaints, who said that entering this university guarantees a bachelor's degree. There are vocational programs within the university. Look at that girl. Does she look like a good student? He Sheng's mother was furious and turned to go back and argue, but He Sheng quickly stopped her, sighing with resignation. "Now do you believe me? Those old men and women are just idle, always gossiping about this and that. Mrs. Lee is the same. She's probably been like this for most of her life, and she won't change. Such people are like FLIs, not biting but disgusting. But after all, she's so old. Besides enduring, what else can you do?" During her time at university, He Sheng was studious and thrived academically. She earned scholarships and took on some part-time jobs outside of school. After 2 years, she had saved up some money. Along with a classmate, she rented a storefront on campus and opened a small shop. They managed it well, with clear division of labor. He Sheng bought a moderately priced car and drove it back home at the end of the year. The fact that He Sheng bought herself a car became big news in the neighborhood. Neighbors gathered around the car, marveling and praising her. "I knew when Zhao Sheng was young that this child would have a bright future. Look, I was right. She's already making money before graduating. She's really talented. Zhao Sheng not only looks beautiful but also has a sharp mind. Zhao Sheng's mother, you've really raised a good daughter." He Sheng's mother was overjoyed. She had endured so much over the years, but this time she truly felt a sense of vindication. However, what He Sheng didn't expect was that shortly after they locked the car and went upstairs, Mrs. Lee approached the crowd and whispered, "How can a girl who studies at school every day have time to earn money?" The previously chattering crowd suddenly fell silent. After 3 seconds of silence, a faint discussion broke out. He Sheng is indeed becoming more and more beautiful. Nowadays, many female college students find sugar daddies. Who knows, maybe she's also being kept by a rich man. Oh, I remember when she was in high school, she was escorted back home by a group of boys. Such an indiscreet girl, It wouldn't be surprising if she's dating a wealthy man. Some young people approached to defend Xianxia. This car isn't a luxury brand, and its market price is only a few tens of thousands of yuan. Rich people wouldn't even look at this kind of car. Yeah, college students often work part-time to earn money. Stop fabricating stories about others all the time. Unable to sway the stubborn old lady's mindset, the young people stopped arguing. They turned and dispersed, leaving behind a group of elderly people sitting on the benches downstairs, continuing to chat idly. Mrs. Li glanced at the windows on the third-floor balcony. Through the clean and shiny glass, she saw the girl chatting and laughing with her mother in the kitchen. Mrs. Li inexplicably thought of her grandson, who spent all day playing games at home, feeling extremely annoyed. She muttered a few more bad things about the people around her to the elderly lady next to her, then stomped home, hands behind her back, in a huff. Xianxia realized that she had become a thorn in Mrs. Li's side. Although she had been a subject of gossip by these old folks since she was young, she knew it was because they spent too much time at home with nothing else to do, so they inevitably discussed other people's affairs to pass the time. What puzzled her was that every time Mrs. Li mentioned her family, she would inexplicably make some sarcastic remarks, which, when heard by others, would quickly morph into rumors. Xianxia didn't know what she had done to offend the old lady. Seeing the neighbors in the community always giving her strange looks, and not just her but even her mother becoming a topic of discussion during tea time, Xianxia couldn't tolerate it anymore. She bought several expensive red dragon fruits from the market and went to knock on Mrs. Li's door. When Mrs. Li saw Xianxia holding fruits, she felt a bit surprised but pretended to be enthusiastic nonetheless. "Oh, Xianxia, dropping by? You're welcome anytime. What's with the fruits?" Xianxia politely smiled and didn't enter the house. After handing the fruits to Mrs. Li, she spoke calmly. "Grandma Li, we've been neighbors for so many years, and you've watched me grow up. I'd like to ask, what did I do to make you dislike me?" Mrs. Li's smile stiffened, and she awkwardly grinned. "What are you talking about? You've always been well-behaved since you were a child. I've always liked you." "Grandma Li, do you believe what you're saying?" Xianxia still smiled politely but kept her distance. "You're old enough to know better. You should understand that while you can eat anything, you can't say anything. Think twice before speaking. Don't spread rumors, true or false, everywhere. Just because I'm young doesn't mean I won't get angry." After saying this, Xianxia felt relieved. She pretended not to notice Mrs. Li's reddening face and casually turned to leave. She felt a lot of the pent-up frustration dissipate from her chest. Xianxia felt that she had said enough to Mrs. Li. It was time for her to tone it down. Indeed, Mrs. Li quieted down for a while, but it was only temporary. After all, gossiping had become a part of her life. Shortly after graduating, Xianxia landed a job in a company where she met a reliable man. Before long, the two got married. They were affectionate, bought a house in the city where they worked, and only visited Xianxia's hometown to see her mother during holidays. Just when Xianxia felt her life was gradually becoming fulfilling, her mother suddenly called her. Her mother's voice sounded weary and weak over the phone as she said, "Xianxia, I've heard it all. Zhang Zhao is keeping a mistress outside. Don't stay with him." Xianxia was both angry and amused. She had a good relationship with Zhang Zhao. Who was this idle gossip monger spreading rumors again? "Mom, Zhang Zhao isn't that kind of person. Don't listen to those neighbors gossiping." After hanging up the phone, Xianxia knew her mother would worry about her. To put her mother's mind at ease, she decided to go back home with Zhang Zhao and let those who gossiped about her husband's character witness it for themselves. Not long after, Xianxia realized how foolish her decision was. Carrying bags of belongings, they entered the residential area where Xianxia's family lived. They chatted affectionately along the way, attracting attention with their handsome and beautiful appearance. Xianxia was already a hot topic in the neighborhood gossip, so as they walked, they received many curious glances. Xianxia paid them no mind and went straight upstairs. Downstairs, the people gathered to dance square dance began to gossip again. Hey, didn't they say his daughter's husband is keeping a mistress? But they seem to have a good relationship now. You don't know anything. This is just how people in big cities live. Besides, once everything's out in the open, how can they continue living like this? They'll just have to make do with it. Xianxia was unaware of the discussion below. She returned to her room and chatted with her mother. Her mother mentioned that the energy-saving light bulb was broken, and Zhang Zhao immediately went downstairs to buy a new one. Xianxia's mother glanced at her son-in-law's back approvingly and smiled contentedly. After chatting for a while, Xianxia noticed her mother's change in attitude towards Zhang Zhao. She couldn't help but sigh with relief. She went to the balcony to collect the dried clothes. Looking down casually, she saw Zhang Zhao being called over by Mrs. Li and having a conversation with her. Xianxia's heart skipped a beat, a sense of foreboding creeping in. Soon after, Zhang Zhao returned with the light bulb. He glanced at Xianxia, and in that glance, Xianxia sensed a hint of unfamiliarity in his eyes. Did the old lady downstairs say something to you? Xianxia asked nervously, approaching Zhang Zhao and grabbing his hand. Don't believe her. Since I was young, she's always disliked me and spread rumors about me. You mustn't believe her. Why are you so flustered? Zhang Zhao released her hand, his tone indifferent, his gaze cold. She didn't say much, just a few things about your past. My past? What past? What have I done? Perhaps Xianxia's tone was too anxious, as Zhang Zhao's brows furrowed tightly, his voice growing louder. Don't you know what you've done? Do I have to spell it out for you? Xianxia, I always thought you were a pure woman, but I never expected you to be so loose. I haven't. Xianxia felt her heart turn ice cold, tears streaming down her face as she cried out. Hearing her voice, her mother came out to check. Seeing the atmosphere between the two cooling down, she quickly walked over and pulled her daughter. What's wrong? Weren't you both fine just now? Xianxia wiped her tears, broke free from her mother, grabbed Zhang Zhao's hand, and walked out. I haven't done those things. I'm going to confront her. Are you not embarrassed enough? Zhang Zhao pushed Xianxia away. She stumbled and fell to the ground. Zhang Zhao clenched his fists, looking at her. Eventually, he didn't go over to help her up. Xianxia, with your reputation in tatters, how dare you go and confront others? How can you be so shameless? Zhang Zhao didn't get to say these words because he saw Xianxia clutching her stomach in pain, a large spreading crimson stain beneath her. It was only at this moment that Zhang Zhao realized his wife was pregnant. Xianxia had lost the baby she had been carrying for 3 months. Her mother suffered a heart attack due to the shock and had to be hospitalized. At this time, Zhang Zhao also proposed a divorce to Xianxia, believing that the child she carried was not his. How ironic! The seemingly indestructible love she once believed in turned out to be so fragile enough that a few words from an old lady could easily sever it, ending their 3-year relationship. When Xianxia's condition improved slightly, her mother was still in the hospital. She went home to get some clean clothes and happened to see a group of gossiping old people downstairs, with Mrs. Li sitting among them. She was talking incessantly, spewing gossip left and right. Seeing Xianxia return, Mrs. Li found a new topic for gossip. As Xianxia entered the building, Mrs. Li lowered her voice and whispered to those around her. Didn't his daughter have a miscarriage a while ago because her husband beat her? I heard that her husband was so angry because the child in his daughter's belly wasn't his at all. In the dim doorway, Xianxia stood under the stairs, not going upstairs but staying in the corner to listen to the idle talk outside. She listened to them gossip about her being loose, shameless, deserving of miscarriage, and deserving of divorce. In the darkness, Xianxia laughed silently. She slowly went upstairs, opened her own door, and went to the kitchen. She picked up a kitchen knife from the cutting board. She remembered a long time ago when she was still a child, Mrs. Li whispered behind her, saying that pretty girls were not good. They were likely to go astray and would definitely cause trouble in the future. Mrs. Li said so much about her. None of it was right, except for that one sentence at the beginning. She had indeed gone astray, and she was about to cause trouble. A glint colder than ice flashed in Yisheng's eyes. She tightened the kitchen knife in her hand, wearing a calm smile on her face. She descended the stairs silently but determinedly.